to the Multimodal Freight Transportation System Improvement Task Force. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Senator Chambers Armstrong, Senator Higdon, Senator Storm, here. Senator Turner, Representative Blanton, here. Representative Freeland,
Present.
Representative Smith, here. Representative Tackett Lafferty,
Here.
Co-Chair Miles,
Here.
Chair Rennell.
Here. Thank you. Before we get started, does anybody have any guests that they'd like to introduce? I do. I have my daughter, Mary Browder, here with me. I thought I'd give everyone else a chance first. I have my daughter, Mary Browder, here with you. Proud to have her up. Glad she was willing to come up and give a couple of her school days before she goes back to college hanging out with me. All right, first, we need to have an approval of our July 18th minutes. Do I have a motion? Motion by Senator Storm. Is there a second? Second. We don't need a vote on that. So, we do need a voice on it. So, all in favor, please signify by saying aye. So, first up, we have the Brian Wright from the Owensboro Riverport and is also chairman of the Kentucky Association of Riverports, and Jennifer Kirchner here from KBT. Floor is yours.
There we go. Okay. Hello. Thank you all for having us today. As Chairman Howell said, I'm Jennifer Kirchner. I'm the Director of Kentuckians for Better Transportation. And we're here to talk to you a little bit today about Riverports, where we are as a state, where we'd like to go, and where we've been. Where's the... No. There we go. Okay, so a little bit of about Riverports. So a Riverport authority can be enacted, a governmental unit by an act of its legislative body, or two or more units acting jointly and with approval of a transportation cabinet can establish a Riverport authority. I figured I would just read that because it's a little convoluted, but the point being that you can establish a Riverport authority and get approval from transportation cabinet. The Kentucky Public Riverport Authorities is established with KRS 65, as you can see there, 510 to 550. The members that are appointed to the Riverport Authority are done so by a mayor, a judge, executive, or both. And currently we have 10 Riverports in Kentucky. 7 of them are active and operational and moving goods, and 3 of them are developing, meaning the movement of goods is not fully in place and operational just yet.
As Jennifer mentioned, we have 10 total ports across the state, and as you can see depicted on this map, 7 of those are active, starting in the western part of the state on the Mississippi, Hickman, Fulton County Riverport Authority, and then moving up the river system, western Kentucky is a developing port, Paducah, McCracken, Eddyville, Henderson, Owensboro, Louisville. Northern Kentucky is a developing port, Maysville, Mason is a developing port, and then Greenup, Boyd County in the far eastern part on the Big Sandy River.
Hinterland. Okay.
As you can see by this map, the same locations of these ports across the entire state cover a mass majority of the state's counties. The green represents the hinterlands within 90 minutes, and the blue represents within 90 miles. When you look at the lump sum of counties across the state of Kentucky, this is well over 80 counties that are considered within reasonable travel distance for heavy cargo moving from the river system or to the river system. Why is this important? Well, if you look across the state, we actually traded over almost 90 million tons. This data goes back to 2018, which represented 18 billion in value. Of that, almost 80% of that tonnage was exchanged with companies outside or organizations outside of the Commonwealth. The transportation system, in addition to just not only the driving miles that are saved, but start with the environmental impact, which is not captured on this PowerPoint. But when you compare multimodal, the modes of transportation, barge is the most efficient when it comes to the impact of the environment, and then second is rail, and then third is truck. When it comes to the wear and tear of our interstates and highways, you can see water transportation saves almost 2.3 billion in vehicle miles traveled just by moving those 89 million tons through and into the state or out of the state. And then over 43 million vehicle hours traveled, which would typically be on the roads and interstates throughout Kentucky. This is made up of a vast, diverse group of commodities such as energy, chemical, agriculture, metals, minerals, that all depend on the waterway system on a daily basis to feed the industry corridors throughout our entire state.
So let's talk about a little bit about how we currently invest in our Riverports. Since 2013, the Commonwealth has supported the Riverport industry through the KRI grant program, the Kentucky Riverport Improvement Grant Program. Current budgeted allocation is $500,000 annually, and you may recall we just had an announcement of some of those projects. The KRI funds are a general fund appropriation, and that is within the Transportation Cabinet's budget. This program also requires a 50% local match. The applications are due each year in May, and for the July 1 fiscal year, the funds must be used by the July 30th of the next fiscal year, and there is no carryover. The funding is very prescriptive in about what it can be used for. There's a list of things that can contribute to the vitality of the Riverport. However, these funds are not to be used for routine maintenance, port operations, plans, or studies. Rather, it's storage facilities, port buildings, equipment, roadways, and railroads. So we have some challenges with the Riverports, and the first one to start with would be inadequate funding. So we had that study that many of you are familiar with now from 2018, and in that study, there's a one-time allocation of $12.3 million for asset preservation. And this really is to stabilize what we have and keep our current assets in good working order. And we'd also increased annual state funding. It needs to be to continued investment. It's leaving us behind of our neighboring states. Riverports are unable to use state grant funds to match federal grants. I know we talk about this a lot, not just in transportation, but oftentimes we like to have state money set up so that it can pull down even greater federal dollars. Right now, the way that the current KRI is, it does not work very well to do such. And again, I mentioned that the funds don't carry over. This directly contributes to an ability of lack of planning, and then they also have to spend it quickly. So the time constraints on the funding don't provide for very good preservation or expansion. And also, which is a bit of an anomaly, we usually don't see this grant program has a 50% match. Typically, we see an 80-20, and oftentimes, especially for our smaller Riverports, coming up with that 50% is not feasible, and they often pass on the opportunity of the KRI funds. So this chart really doesn't need much explaining. You can easily see we're similar in number of ports, but we're drastically different in the amount that we fund our ports. So that's $500,000 for Kentucky compared to millions and millions. Illinois at $150 million. Currently, $40 million of that is in a fund going to the Cairo Riverport Authority, which will be direct competitors with Owensboro and other Kentucky markets. So we even see in Missouri, they allocated some ARPA funds. So states are going about it in different ways. Point being that we are lacking on our investment and our assets are suffering because of it.
So on the prior slides, you saw Jennifer talk about asset preservation. As part of our study that was conducted over the last several years for all public ports across the state, there was 3 key areas: asset preservation, modernization, and expansion for the future. So I wanted to share a little bit on the asset preservation portion of that. As you know, most of our ports were built in the late 60s, early 70s. What we consider preservation, and the study also considers this the same, is that preservation is for business as usual. So what capital items are needed or what improvements are needed across all the ports for just sustaining the business as usual. Each of these ports are similar in base commodities. Almost all the ports across the state handle grain and fertilizer without a doubt. It's key to the state of Kentucky for outbound grain as well as inbound fertilizer. But all other commodities around these two base commodities are really based on geography and how each of these ports relate to the industry locations across the state. Some examples of asset preservation. We took the top 5 capital items across the entire state, across the ports, and these are just some of the examples to represent what asset preservation would mean. Hickman, grain conveyor replacement, $4.5 million. In Hickman specifically, they rely 75% of their business is really outbound grain. So in order for them to take a conveying system that was built in the late 60s, mid 70s, and upgrade it to the standards it needs to be for output and sustainability long term, $4.5 million in just asset preservation for Hickman. Paducah, very similar. Every barge that comes into Paducah, they have to rest on the mooring sails and or dolphins in the water. They have 2 different types of sail setups, almost $700,000 just to get those mooring sails and dolphins back in working order. An example in Owensboro, heavy lift equipment. We handle quite a bit of heavy commodities, and I'll share some of that here shortly. But to sustain our heavy equipment that was either purchased in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, in order to move daily 5 to 6 days a week, we have to maintain a certain amount of investment in our equipment. Now, looking forward from a modernization and expansion standpoint, to optimize port efficiency, expand markets to attract new anchor tenants, and to serve new industries. These are just some of these examples, but if you look at Henderson has 1 warehouse now. It pretty much stays full. They're looking in the future of building an additional warehouse for a minimum of $2 million. Louisville, one of the major metros on the Ohio River, just down the road from here, cargo dock, roughly, this is just a portion of it. They are in desperate need of revamping their laydown area and all of the place that they have access to the river, as well as their gantry crane, and potentially build a new dock in the future. Owensboro, looking forward to developing industries to come to utilize rail and river. We have 50-acre rail site that's currently undeveloped, and we just need $1 million, for an example, to get it in a position where we can actually use it with base aggregate on it. Shifting gears a little bit to talk about Owensboro Riverport specifically, we see ourselves as one of the larger ports across the state, both from the diversity of commodities that we handle, but also through in regards to ton throughput. This is our last year, 22-23, inbound volume, a little over 1.2 million tons. To put it in perspective, 438 barges came in and or outbound from the Owensboro Riverport. That represents 27,000 trucks that would otherwise be on our interstate systems or our county roads. Rail, 230,000 short ton, which represents 96,000 trucks and 2,300 rail cars. And then inbound truck, 329,000 short ton, 13,700 trucks. The inbound truck number is primarily inbound grain. I think other facilities throughout the state handle more of that type of grain, but that 329,000 represents predominantly grain and some other commodities. The key commodities that we handle in Owensboro: grain, fertilizer, both dry and liquid, salt, aluminum, copper, steel, paper, graphite, many others. So how do we generate revenue? And this applies mostly to all the ports across the state. We have public rates for the use of our equipment. For an example, if a Sterritt crane needed to take a large piece of equipment on a barge or off a barge, we would lease to them an hourly rate for our particular equipment if it would meet their needs, and or lease to them our dock or our wharfing area for them to be able to load or unload. Another example, we lease facilities. In our particular case, we own a grain facility. We lease that to CGB. And we also have land leases for other tenants like Nutrient Ag and several others. On a day-to-day basis, beyond the long-term leases or the short-term leases, it's really a per-ton throughput. So for an example, this past year, we handled 390,000 tons of aluminum inbound. Each of those tons, we generate revenue based off of what type of commodity it is and how much time it takes us specifically at the port, and they pay us a per ton rate for the inbound as well as the outbound. So how does Owensboro Riverport apply to economic development? And I just tried to capture a couple examples of some relevant examples in the past few years. One specifically, 131 jobs added to a local auto chassis manufacturer. This was unique in the fact that we had a local industry roughly 4 miles from the port that lacked the access to rail in order to load their chassis to ship to Chrysler in particular. We worked with them. We also worked with the state through our local economic development corporation to allow for permitting loads of 6-inch overhang within 3-4 miles of the port only. And the end result is now we ship roughly 2,500 auto chassis frames for them 5 days a week. And they added 131 jobs to their facility and really kept their facility moving going forward. It's just one example of how we try to support local economic development. Another example is that we were a Build Grant recipient back in 2018. This was, at the time, a $14.4 million total project, $11.5 million federal dollars to rebuild the entry road, what they call the last mile. So the last mile between interstate and connecting to river and rail is what they deem as the last mile, critical mile sector. The benefit of this particular grant is that it also enhances the access for all the industries between the interstate and the Riverport, such as the growing Swedish Match organization and several others. Back in 2018, we conducted an economic impact study, and it was broken up into different impacts, but the one example that I share with you today is when you take our 16 million in total output, what does that mean to the local region? Well, it represents 8.6 million of labor income, almost 200 jobs annually supported, and that's just in that 1 year. If you look over the past 5 years prior to that, 2013-18, it represents 7 million in labor income and approximately 161 jobs for our region. And those jobs are suppliers of equipment, maintenance type organizations, fleeting service, towboat operators, construction workers on specific projects we may have within the port, and other examples of what makes up that impact from a jobs perspective in Davis County.
So that's a lot. I hope we demonstrated to you the activity that's going on at Riverports and all that there is to be realized for Kentucky. So one of the things that through this actually well over a year of working with the Riverports, we spent a lot of time discussing what are some possible solutions. And we realized quickly that there's some very simple ones, pretty straightforward. So the first would be that one-time preservation asset allocation, as the study mentioned. Here you'll see we have 15 million because inflation. I guess that's a good hashtag for almost any kind of presentation. So we settled on 15 million as a one-time allocation, and there would be no required match for these funds. And then we think that it's very important to increase annual sustainable funding. Actually, first, let me do the next point. So my bad. So increased annual sustainable funding. One of the things that we have found in our research is that there's currently a commercial watercraft property tax. And that tax is I don't recall the percentages, but some goes to the state general fund and others are distributed to the local government. We don't want to do anything with the local portion, but the thought was that tax generated by the people using the Riverports, if rather it going to the general fund, actually went into became a sustainable revenue mechanism for Riverports. we have some preliminary numbers that show that amount may be around 5 or 6 million. And really, the one-time asset preservation really only makes sense if you couple it with that sustaining funding mechanism. We don't want to keep coming back and saying just one more time, 15 million. We really want this investment to work for Riverports, and then for us to just realize the expansion that's possible. So one other thing I think that's important to mention that we've realized is currently, if you recall, I said that the $500,000 goes to the KRI, which is the Riverport Improvement Grant Program, and that is within the Transportation Cabinet's budget. There is also a Riverport Financial Assistance Trust Fund that has been established by KRS 174, and this actually allows for the money that goes in it to much more fit the needs of the Riverports. So there is allowed to be a carryover. If you recall, the KRI funds was no carryover, so the time constraint to use the money is very difficult. And a decrease in it from the local match of 50% to 20%, which is much more in line with what we see in many government grants. So the one-time asset preservation fee or investment, but we also have identified a sustainable funding mechanism as well as an existing trust fund that works for this money to go into to better suit the Riverport's needs. So to me, there's a lot about this that is common sense, and the tweaks that we're talking about will really support the Riverports and their longevity and their needs. So I think with that, if you have questions for Brian and I know we still have Amanda and Greg. They're going to come and talk to you a little bit more about the specifics for their ports on economic development. But happy to take any questions if you have any.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions on any of this?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your presentation. I, for one, am supportive of your 15 million, and I think we need to increase your annual amounts you're getting as well. But my question is on the taxes that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And those taxes are on the barges themselves, is that correct?
Yes.
Would that be similar to taxes, similar but different, I guess, to taxes we have on recreational boats?
So it doesn't include those, but similar. So it would, the commercial watercraft property tax, there's a list, and mostly there's no recreational watercraft involved in that. They're all tugboats, barges, boats that you actually use the port. The one exception that's in there is the dining cruise boats, excursion boats. But other than that, it has nothing to do with a personal watercraft.
So I'm just wondering, and I asked that in comparison because there is some type of loophole, marine loophole, like on houseboats, and they're not paying these things.
I've been told that.
And I'm paying them on my fishing boat, and you guys are paying them on your barges. It's just not adding up to me. So I just wanted to.
But no, it's similar in that it's a property tax, but different in.
Maybe you ought to call your barges houseboats. So thank you.
It's nice to see people push for equity in taxing.
Yeah.
Co-Chair Miles.
Thank you. First, I want to compliment Brian is definitely one of our homegrown, and we appreciate him and the job he does there. But I do have a few questions. You brought up the Kentucky Riverport Improvement Grant Program, and I don't know if there's any of the counties that are eligible for some of that matching gap funding on House Bill 9. I don't know if you all have looked at that, if there's options on that. We see some head shaking, so I'm assuming that yes.
Senator Howe has been great with explaining some of that to us. So I know we've brought it back and we're looking into it. I don't know if anybody has identified an exact match with House Bill 9 yet, but we're certainly trying to spread the word.
And then I noticed whenever you were some of the solutions, it was just a simple 15 million, right?
Just simple.
Simple
Yes.
15
simple.
million. And I know he kind of, as he was going through and a lot of the things, you know, when I look at 12,500 chassis going out, that's a substantial number.
It is.
And I know those are normal numbers for you all, but as far as us listening to them to soak in those numbers compared to the amount of trucks and everything are astronomical. I know another one of the solutions, and this has been brought up multiple times, as far as the funding being a carryover funding, so you could bank that towards larger projects, maybe something that we could look at. And then can you all address some of the safety issues as far as riverways and things like that compared to, I know you're dependent on the weather, obviously, on some of that, but then on the other side of it, as far as kind of measuring that based compared to road, rail, all of that.
First of all, thank you for the compliment. There are statistical numbers that compare barge, rail, and truck as it relates to safety and accidents, and I don't have the exact numbers with me, but when you compare them per ton mile traveled, barge is deemed the safest, and then rail is secondary, and it follows very similar to the environmental impacts because of the volume of tons that you carry per mile versus a truck that carries 24 tons, 23 tons per mile down the road. You're carrying 1,500 to 1,800 tons on a barge. So by pure volume alone, you are a safer comparison to the other modes. And honestly, I don't know the exact numbers, and I would hate to quote you an incorrect one.
But as far as, are there any issues that we have any concerns as far as our waterways? I guess as far as Kentucky's concerned, do we have any issues through the core of things that we need to be paying attention to above directly what some of the requests are today?
There are obviously federal concerns on the Marine Highway, the M70, which Owensboro, and the M55, which is on the Mississippi. The locks and dams have to be maintained. They are currently backlogged with maintenance repairs to a lot of those locks and dams. And the Olmsted lock was, launched several years ago, replaced lock 52 and 53. And honestly, that should have been many years ahead of that, but it was barely just in time because locks 52 and 53 beginning to fail routinely to the point they had to shut down the navigation in order to repair those before Olmsted. So that's going to continue to happen over time. The dollar amount to maintain those locks and dams is unreal when you're comparing to other types of infrastructure improvements. However, if you think back to a little over a year ago when the Mississippi drought occurred, one benefit the state of Kentucky had was that we had locks and dams to maintain that pool of water. So we had minimal impacts, partly because of the locks and dams retaining that water, but also because our Corps did a significant amount of dredging through the systems to keep navigation moving. But when you compare it below the Olmsted lock and dam, there are none. So they had no way to retain water of any kind at any pool anywhere along the Mississippi. So for that reason, the locks and dams are critical. They're important. They do serve a purpose, but they're very expensive. And I know some other organizations such as the IRPT is really pushing, on the federal side to make sure that they keep allocating the word of dollars to make sure those locks and dams are maintained.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a couple questions, if possible. But first of all, I appreciate you coming and testifying today. Some of the questions I'll have is because I'm not educated on ports. So if you had we've heard your need for bringing things up to par, what you need to bring your port as far as, the $15 million. Looking beyond that, have you ever done a feasibility study on what the possible usage would be for your port if you were able to, and again, I'm going to probably ask some crazy questions, but I want them, I've passed ports in Florida, in Jacksonville mainly, for years, and I've seen probably 40, 50 cranes. I've seen a lot of boxes. And then we hear about the supply chain issue, the problems that are existing, and I believe a lot of federal dollars are in the pipeline for that, to find remedies for that. if and I guess a vision would be, can Kentucky be a part of that supply chain issue, since there's 6 to 8 months, 10 months waiting list in the ports that we have in existence. If you had a roadmap that maybe a wish list, as a lot of people use the term, is there a possibility for your port to become a hub, such as in transport on boxes, going to trucks, to rail, and opening Kentucky up for a to supply supply chain? Is that even feasible? Is it something that you could see us partaking in if we invested $500 million in our ports, and we bought 25, 30 cranes, and we opened up the river to the shipping companies? And again, goes back to last year. We had a meeting in transportation. We had a shipping company come in, and we were talking about $5 million just to try to get some repair work done. I said, if you had the possibility of increasing the size of the port, how much could you use? And he says, as much as you can handle, in shipping, as much as we can handle. Well, that just started, spinning wheels in my brain, thinking, can we utilize our ports in Kentucky to expand into a transport hub? I mean, is that something that's doable if the dollars are there? If we invest in that rather than just repairing, if we took some of our investment, our long-term reserve, and we started investing in ports, is that something that can be done? I guess is my first question.
From my perspective, yes, it is feasible. Has it been studied? Yes, for many, many years. And some of the key challenges, whether it's in Owensboro or any other port across the state, is when it comes to container movement, where we are missing the boat, no pun intended, is that you have to look at it at a national level from the standpoint that the shippers who own these containers, for an example, in New Orleans, Mobile, or other, they retain those containers and only allow those to leave that port area for 6 days max. So it takes 10 days to get from New Orleans to Owensboro, less than 10 for further down west. St. Louis is currently trying to initiate a program, and the intent behind it is that they're looking at a faster shuttle boat for container movement on the inland river system, but they're holistically working with larger partners such as the shippers and the commercial companies. There's a container movement between Baton Rouge and Houston today for resins, and it goes back and forth between those 2 points. The one challenge we see in the state of Kentucky is volume. What volume can come up the river? So when you put containers on a barge, if I remember right, you're looking at 80 to 100 containers on a barge that can cube out the weight of the barge at 1,500, and you can fill those same containers back to the shipper, which is 10 days away. So now you're tied into 20. The grain companies continue to look at it. Ingram Barge continues to look at it. Engineering firms continue to look at ideas on how we could do that. What we have done locally, and I say locally through the Inland Riverport Terminal Association, is try to look at potential milk runs of containers between Paducah and Cincinnati, and how could we create a closed loop system to move container movement between, just within the state of Kentucky. Nothing has really been able to get off the ground with any of those projects because of the sheer volume required from someone or multiples to fill that barge up in its entirety.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. So I guess in asking that, we know a lot of the supply chain problems at the port is through customs, is through clearance. Do you see any need in a customs clearance with your port in talking to Paducah, they was interested in a customs. They have I guess you're duty free. You have a duty free, or there's a tax incentive, some sort of a federal tax incentives, some of these ports. But in looking at customs, would customs open up any other business for you if you were able to clear your what you're transporting? Is that something that you've thought about, or is that something that would interest you?
We currently, in most of the ports, have an active foreign trade zone.
Yeah, for a trade zone. Okay.
In our particular case, we have a foreign trade zone. And we clear materials that come in foreign status from New Orleans. So if customer X asks us to maintain it as foreign and they want to defer the duties that they have to pay until later, then they bring that product up, bonded, up the Ohio River, for an example, or rail, has to be bonded. We receive that in as foreign status material through certain documentation, through what customs requires. We manage that administration on our side, and then we report that to the customs office in Evansville, Indiana. And it would be the same in Louisville. They would report it potentially to the Louisville office. But they hold us accountable for managing that administration and the documentation requirements for holding foreign status or releasing to domestic.
Okay.
And they audit us on an annual basis. We do not typically have to have customs agents enter our port. Anything that's really inspected on the onset is done at the ocean ports primarily. It's really about managing what status that product is when it's moved up somewhere beyond the ocean port as a bonded material. So for an example, on more than one occasion with the steel duties required, there's a quota that companies have to abide by federally and not exceed that quota amount per month. So we'll have a customer occasionally say, hey, we're exceeded our quota for April. We're going to go ahead and send this barge up bonded, receive it in as foreign status material, hold it, and they pay us administrative fees to do that. And then when they tell us, we'll release it to domestic, and then they'll pay their duties accordingly.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, some just kind of some follow-ups on what you were talking about. Brian, you were talking about the studies of how to move containers up and down rivers. I love it. You refer to it as a milk run between Paducah and Cincinnati. Was part of those studies using that in conjunction with offloading onto rail or road for distribution as well to be able to increase your volume? If I didn't fully ask a question, I can build out on it.
I think I understand. I mean, in some cases, yes. In other cases, maybe not. It depends. One of the challenges with rail and container movement is that we cannot take off a container off of a rail track or a rail chassis or put a container back on a rail chassis. That has to be done by the rail line at those locations, for an example, in Louisville. So if someone, I'll give you an example, we had some steel product that needed to be shipped into the foreign trade zone. It was in containers. It had to go to Louisville first, and then it had to be trucked to Owensboro to be put in a warehouse in the foreign trade zone. We unloaded the containers once it arrived, but the rail will limit if you can touch their chassis on or off. So that is where it creates problems. What we can do on the ports is we can bring containers off the river, put them back on the river, we can unload them and load them back at the port. But we can't necessarily touch the rail side of it without it being trucked in from either Evansville, Indiana, in our case, or Louisville, Kentucky.
Ostensibly in that situation, if you had enough volume demand for loading onto rail, then you could coordinate with the particular rail line to put somebody in there for them.
Yes.
And then that kind of goes back to your volume question, though, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And how do you get to enough volume density to be able to make this work inland? You had also referenced a little bit in one of your slides about commodities in and out, and you talked a lot about that. I just wanted to kind of, and I'll put you on the spot here, and if I ask you some random questions you don't know, it's okay. I'm not trying to put you on the spot on anything, but a couple of things that just stood out to me. Some of your products I understand, some of them I don't. Can you just kind of explain to us, to get a better example, why would you offload salt in Owensboro, Kentucky? What do you use that for?
Salt is really the generic word, but the technical word is flux, which is essentially a salt that's used in the manufacturing process, put into the smelters at the aluminum companies throughout Kentucky. Another application, especially today with the demand for recycled aluminum growing, companies are looking at 55 to 85% renewable as part of their aluminum. So companies are beginning to pop up that take flux and put it into their the rest with their recycled materials to produce a aluminum commodity of XYZ. So in our case, it's industrial salt.
Okay. Is that kind of the way it works for graphite as well? Is that why you offload graphite? What's graphite used for? Kind of for your local area businesses.
The graphite is really around geography. There are super sacks that come in internationally into New Orleans, and we're deemed somewhat of a midpoint for distribution for various different companies. And it may not necessarily only be graphite. It could be a combination of different minerals in a super sack for this large company that provides multiple types of minerals for applications, manufacturing applications around Kentucky, as far as Cincinnati, down to Nashville, and other locations.
So this stuff comes to Owensboro, for lack of a better way of putting it, as a staging location to distribute. I hate to use hub and spoke, but
Correct.
It's quicker to go by different means from Owensboro out.
Correct.
Okay.
And the primary reason for that is capacity on the river, the cargo dock that we have, and the piece of equipment that we have, and then secondarily the fact that we have indoor storage.
Combination of supply and demand factors. Everything breaks down to supply and demand, doesn't it? So the reason I'm asking some of these questions is to focus on the economic development component of this. It sounds great for us to just talk about loading and unloading freight for something to do, but I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what that means for your community, for existing businesses, and possibly for businesses that want to locate to the area, or that you could support even non-existing businesses. I was trying to do the mental math on a map when you were talking about a lot of the aluminum issues, and my guess is that Owensboro is one of the closer ports that could handle this to the aluminum plants in Logan County, for instance. So can you just kind of talk in general terms about what having a Riverport and with certain capacity and capabilities does for economic development purposes?
Yes. Aluminum, I think, is a good example. On an annual basis, last year was a record. We handled roughly 390,000 tons of what's called P10. Did my mic go out?
No, it looks like it's still on. It's not you.
Aluminum in Owensboro, Kentucky, services major companies such as Commonwealth in Hallsville, Kentucky, Southwire, which is continuing to grow, especially with the EV market expanding and the need for ability to provide power. Logan Aluminum down in Russellville, major consumer. Warwick, Indiana, the Kaiser plant right across the river. Cobe Aluminum down in Bowling Green that supplies a lot of automotive. So those are some of the key large consumers of that aluminum. We ship roughly 1,500 tons a day. In order to ship 1,500 tons a day, you have to have drivers. They make approximately 3 turns per day, which equates to about anywhere from 80, 60, 70, 80, 90 trucks a day of employed drivers that stay local. So they shuttle 3 trips to Logan, and then they're going home. And then they come back the next day, 3 trips to Logan or 3 trips to Commonwealth. And that's repetitive 5 days a week when it comes to help and support part of that 197 employees I mentioned earlier back in 2018. Other examples of how industries like the Riverports support economic development when it comes to moving commodities is having the pure ability on the river to handle different products. Point in case, the ability to have rail at your site is important. There's a particular job going on for a gas company about 20 miles from where the port is. They're bringing in a large number of heavy steel pipe on rail that's going to be transferred from that rail to the truck and moved 20 miles down the road. Otherwise, they would have had to have permitting. These are 80 foot in length, so they're pretty difficult to drive down the road and pretty much have to be put on a barge or rail. Another example, I mentioned copper as one of our commodities. Copper typically comes out of the west. Supply of copper to ensure that their customers never ran out of coiled copper because it comes so far west. So they had to create inventory system closer into the Midwest just to supply their end users and never fail on their service to the end users.
Kind of building on what you were talking about with aluminum, some of this stuff is intuitive to me, at least, and some is counterintuitive. So you talked about, let's talk about aluminum for a little bit. It sounds to me like Owensboro is relatively centrally located to a lot of businesses involved in aluminum production or aluminum usage. And then you mentioned that the demand for aluminum continues to increase. So ostensibly their demand for your services will increase with that. Is there anything in our space for helping develop out your Riverport that needs to be done so that you can, one, meet increasing demand in this area, or two, kind of drive increasing demand for this area by showing that you have the ability to onload, offload, whatever you need to do? Those are the types of things that I sense that we've been missing for years in our Riverport industry, and if it's been done and talked about and everything from an economic development standpoint, I've never seen it. Is there anything, just it may or may not be, but just to take this as an example and take us down a rabbit hole for a minute, is there anything in this situation that the Owensboro Riverport needs to be able to do to show that it can meet increasing demand with this area?
Yes, and we typically look at those types of improvements internally, looking outward based off of our service to provide to the customer. However, I do know some of these major aluminum consumers throughout the state are looking for other ways that they can connect across the state to help grow their business long term. As for an example, in particular, one company in the further south spoke at some of our recent conferences just to share the magnitude of what they're trying to do long term. From my perspective, there needs to be a closer loop of that communication, potentially through the state or through the Cabinet for Economic Development, and then let us help in different ways that we can. Unfortunately, many times the ports being locally controlled, essentially, we're in a bit of a vacuum other than what we know as individuals or what we know as a business development that we can reach out to some of these local industries. So there's some opportunities there to better connect our capabilities and our capacities as Riverports with a larger group of industries across the state.
You know, one of the things that we see in a lot of things, we tout Kentucky as an automotive state because we get enough density that it makes sense. You have derivative suppliers and this sort of thing. The aluminum industry has to work in a similar fashion. Has anyone, to your knowledge, ever discussed building on the relative density that we have for aluminum in this particular area to recruit additional users, suppliers, manufacturers of aluminum products? There's a pricing point in there where it becomes cheaper the more you can do in one spot. Has anyone ever talked to you about anything like this from state economic development, or has that ever been any kind of discussion you've ever been involved in?
Not to my knowledge. It's not necessarily a point of discussion with the cabinet or the industry as a whole. But, I mean, to your point, there's a huge opportunity there from the standpoint we are a major aluminum consumer. That is why, in our particular case, we as a state, our particular case is the Riverport, we have the London Metal Exchange as a backstop, and we have the Chicago Mercantile Exchange as a backstop for this aluminum commodity because of the amount that's consumed in the state of Kentucky and in the region. I can tell you firsthand that, in a perfect world, aluminum consumers would receive exact amount of aluminum at the right price at the right time and never run the risk of running out. And it just doesn't quite happen that way because it's so market driven as a commodity, and it's traded frequently, and they're holding out and waiting for the better price. And so in between has to be some amount of volume to help accommodate the magnitude of volume that's consumed. As I mentioned, we ship a barge a day, which is relevant to about 2,200 to 2,300 pieces at 3/4 of a ton apiece that feed the state sector.
Kind of going from a micro back to a macro kind of question on this. How often, if at all, are you involved with economic development from a state level? How often do they reach out to you about projects they're working on to see if you have the capacity to support a business that's looking to come to Kentucky or to expand in Kentucky? Is that a type of discussion that ever comes up?
It does through our local economic development corporation typically, but it's not for capacity. It's more of potential land on an industry that may need to utilize the river and or rail or a combination of both that specifically request as part of their RFP to be on the river system. In regards to utilizing our existing capacity as a port or ports across the state, I don't know that there's enough understanding to know what those capacities are.
When you say no, there's not enough, and don't know if there's enough understanding on what those capacities are, can you explain that, please? Sorry to put you on the spot here.
Well, unless you've visited a Riverport, it's really hard to understand. And it doesn't matter if you're in Hickman or in Greenup Boyd. In many cases in Owensboro, most of the general public doesn't understand what the Riverport does. So unless you know how transportation works when it comes to heavy commodities, it's difficult to grasp that there's a potential there. So a lot of it comes down to education, more education and awareness, and I think we as ports can obviously do a better job of making that a point to educate the best that we can, but collectively as a state, I think there's an opportunity for us to all collectively work together to utilize, to the point of this task team is how do we optimize our multimodal across the state, whether it's air, rail, river, or other.
And last question I think I have, and this is just something that I didn't remember hearing before. You were talking about in the usage of your Riverport, if a business needed your crane to offload, or that you would lease that out to them. How does that work from a labor standpoint? Do your port people, do your employees do this for them? Is that part of the lease agreement, or you just lease your infrastructure out and the businesses hire a third party or bring their own people in to do this?
Lease as in lease facilities, or you're talking about the hourly rate?
The hourly rate part, sorry.
Okay.
Thank
For
you.
an hourly rate, for an example, we have a mobile harbor crane, has 84-ton lift capacity. We have specialized operators that run that piece of equipment. If XYZ company came to us and say, we need to load out a certain piece, we would help evaluate that piece. We would use potentially their engineers. Our operator would load that piece with their supervision. Another example could be is that we may tandem lift a larger piece with a third-party company utilizing our crane and our operator. Most of the time, if 9 times out of 10, it's our equipment and our operators. If a company, for whatever reason, had something to unload from their truck into a warehouse, it would be our operator, and that would be a throughput rate.
I'll ask, if you don't mind, ask a question. I think the point that you were trying to get to on economic development, and I'll try to ask it in a, basically you all respond to whatever comes towards you, if someone says, can you unload this, or whatever that may be. From the economic development standpoint at the state level, do they ever come to you and ask for a list of all possible options of things that you could provide? I mean, I think that's basically what we're trying to figure out. Are we doing enough at the state level with economic development to offer? You said you work mainly through the economic development locally, that they come to them, will ask for something, you work from that direction. So I guess you all are responding to a request, if you get it, of can you handle this or can you handle that?
Yes.
There's not a proactive side to that of this is the list of buffets of things that we could offer, things that we are not going after, things that we are not supplying. If we needed someone for the aluminum industry to be a component of that you all have a list of those items advocated for. Economic development doesn't have a good list of that to promote our ports, to promote any and all of our access to transportation.
Correct.
So I guess that's what I think you were trying to get to it in a way, but it's the difference between being reactive and proactive is what we're looking at right now. That from economic development standpoint, you all have some opportunities out there, but no one's really asked for the list of what all you could do and how you could provide those items. Is that what you were trying to?
Yeah, thank you. Sometimes I need help focusing on my point on things. More often I'd probably like to admit, and I'd like to just build on that a little bit. That is a big part of what we're doing. We're not looking at Riverports just for the sake of Riverports. It's how they fit into overall economic development. And we had Secretary Knoll come in last meeting and talk about this a lot. I get the sense that they're doing a lot of, I hate to use terms like this, but a lot of vertical integration in how we do economic development or how we do Riverport utilization, either one, and they seem to go hand in glove on this. Kind of building on the aluminum theme, if there was a business that was looking to locate or that the state wanted to go after, I would think they would need to coordinate with you or go, you do a lot of this. If we bring anything else in for X amount of tonnage extra, are you going to be able to handle this? And if not, then how are we going to get you to the point where you can handle it?
Correct.
And my sense is that none of that sort of thing really exists. And from our standpoint, I'll speak just for me, not for anybody else on the committee. Those are the types of things that I think we want to kind of look at in this, and take this from a ROI standpoint too. You can always spend money on things, but I wanted to kind of focus on some of the things we can do to see what we could do with the money that we invest and how that returns a benefit for the Commonwealth. And that's kind of the basis of those questions. So thank you for breaking me out and getting me back on point there. I need that help a lot.
If I may, just to point out, in the freight study, that was captured as a key opportunity for us collectively from the freight analysis study, that there needs to be some clear direction on how we tie to economic development and vice versa across the state. We have taken that study, when I say we, the KAR and the KBT, and we've tried to initiate some of those discussions. But I think long term, it's going to take a bigger perspective really to define on how that should look.
Thank you. If no one else has any questions, we appreciate your time coming up here and doing this. Appreciate all the hard work you do for the organization as well.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Greg Curlin from Hickman Port and Amanda Davenport from Lake Bartney Partnership. Jennifer, you don't mind, would you just sit tight in case we need
Yes,
something
sir.
from KBT
I'm happy
standpoint?
to. Yes, sir.
These two might get lonely without you.
You're talking multimodal transportation. It's my favorite topic.
I know you love it so much anyway.
This is actually fun for me. I will say you cannot talk economic development without a transportation plan.
It doesn't go very far very fast.
You
does
can't.
it?
No. So I agree with you.
Will the two of you introduce yourselves, please?
Good afternoon. I'm Amanda Davenport. I'm the Executive Director of the Lake Barkley Partnership. We're a regional economic development organization in Caldwell, Crittenden, Lyon, and Livingston counties.
I'm Greg Curlin. I'm with the Hickman-Fulton County Riverport Authority. That's in far west Kentucky on the Mississippi River. That's unique. We do not have any I'm messing it up here. I don't have any locks and dams, so everything coming from New Orleans is coming straight up without any interference as far as that goes, except for the low water. That does affect us greatly. So,
if you could affect when it rains, you'd be in high demand. Kind of as a point of privilege, before we do this, I want to point out to everyone that we seem to have the two chairs seem to have our local people in, and I was smart enough to defer to leadership to let her and her Riverport director go first. But it doesn't mean we're not glad to see you two as well. I've worked with both of you. I've worked with Amanda a lot on this stuff for a lot of my district, and I think Greg, I think you and I started working together in about 1983 when you and Melanie started being our United Methodist Youth Group leaders. So we've been together for a long time, but it's good to have you up here. Amanda, why don't you start us off and just kind of talk about what the Riverport in Eddyville looks like and how it interacts with what you're trying to do locally.
Okay, great. So I wear multi hats, and in addition to being the executive director of the Lake Barkley Partnership, I work hand in hand with our Eddyville Riverport. I'm also the chair-elect of the Kentucky Association for Economic Development, and I serve on the Water Transportation Advisory Board. So I think everything we're talking about today is very in my wheelhouse, and much of what I'll talk about is the organization of the Eddyville Riverport and how they focus on economic development. So the Eddyville Riverport, or ERIDA, because the Eddyville Riverport and Industrial Development Authority is a mouthful, was established in 1976 like most of the other riverports across Kentucky. One of the things that makes our riverport a little bit different is that in the early 2000s, the industrial park was deeded to the Riverport Board. So as far as we can tell, we are the only riverport organization that also owns and controls the land use and development of our industrial park. So everything that we do at the Riverport really has a lens of how does that play into our economic development at the industrial park. And really my role with the Riverport is I'm their economic developer. So though I don't work for the Riverport Board, I work for our local economic development group. I basically serve as the economic developer for the board, overseeing what we're doing long-term strategy at both the Riverport and the industrial park. So it's trying to make it as clear as mud as I can for everybody. So the Eddyville Riverport and their industrial park, I'm going to give a highlight of their industries. The Riverport is really focused on agriculture with both grain and fertilizer, maritime with both pleasure boats and barge, and tourism. Which that goes into that's the pleasure boat. Maritime, we have barge construction and barge repair. Our Riverport directly supports 100 jobs through its 6 tenants at the port and the port operating staff. And then we support about 3,200 agriculture jobs from the farmers that come into our port to offload grain onto barges. The industrial park is really focused, right now their existing tenants are trucking facility that supports some of the big manufacturers in our region and chemicals manufacturer. We are looking to continue to build on the supply chain of plastics, electric vehicles, and some small manufacturers as we develop our industrial park. Okay. Some of the capital improvements that we have been able to make at our both port and park are because the board owns 2 different facilities. So that opens us up to some different grant programs that we can apply for across both facilities, that if you're only a Riverport or you're only an industrial park, you're limited. You can't always apply for both programs. We also can share revenue generation between the 2 facilities. So if money is made at the Riverport through put-through charges or ground leases or equipment leases, very similar to Owensboro revenue structure, we can then use those funds in investing in the industrial park. Or likewise, any investment that is generated through the industrial park, if we sell land or if we lease land, can then go back into the investment that we make at the Riverport. So because of that structure, we've really been able to make a lot of bigger investments across both facilities. In the past 4 years, we've received $1 million worth of grants and only had to provide about $630,000 of match through those grants. And again, that's because we've been able to use our revenue to match state, federal, and local grants. And then we've been able to access some grants that don't have a match through different utility partners, or I think a lot of our Riverports are in the TVA footprint, so we receive the TVA in lieu of taxes. That's been a huge, huge thing that helps our communities and a smaller community. And let me go back one. Yep. So what we've really been focused on a lot is more of the asset preservation. Even with this $1.6 million, it's all been focused on purchasing equipment, developing sites, and improving a lot of the safety at both the industrial park and the Riverport. In 2021, we received a PIDP grant to build a new inlet at our Riverport. And I've got some photos on the next couple of slides to show you guys. So I'm going to start with the Eddyville Industrial Park and why this is important. So this photo was taken probably in 2018. You can see, so the industrial park on the foreground, kind of up to that tree line and then to that building, that's all one site that is rail served. And the Riverport board owns the rail spur. So we control all of the rail access that comes off the main line into the park. And then kind of in the background behind the facility where those trees are, that's also part of our industrial park. Some of the grants we received were for master planning. And if we go to the next slide, thank you so much, Jennifer.
No, you're fine.
This is what our industrial park looks like today. We were able to build this very large site. That's an 80-acre rail-served site that we can market as a multimodal access site because it has rail, it's 1 mile off the interstate, and it's only 5 miles from the Riverport. And because the port owns the industrial park, if I have an industrial prospect that comes in and says, I need river access, I can make that a priority with my port and say, we have to serve this, we can't lose this project, this is what needs to happen. And then if we'll go to the next slide. So I'm going to be really turned around on the far side of the screen, which looks like the right, if you're looking at it, kind of in the trees where that little drawing is. That's what our PDIP grant is going to go to continue to develop basically a new inlet that can provide more barge access at our Riverport. If you look, this is only about 30 acres of land that has been developed at the port, because the rest of it is covered in made of rocks and a very covered hill. So if y'all want to give us more than $15 million, I would be more than happy to blast that whole thing and make it nice and flat. But again, because we look at long-term development of both facilities, we know that this inlet has some flexibility in either serving our existing port tenants, rearranging the footprint at the port to better utilize the land, or dedicating that space to an industrial user if we have a user that needs to ship materials directly on and off the river. And then just to kind of sum it up, we were just talking about, how do Riverports and transportation tie into economic development? So these are some of the biggest projects that we've seen. Now, the Calvert Chemical Complex is not a recent project, but especially for Western Kentucky, the knowledge and existing chemical base that we have there really helps to support all the battery projects that we're seeing across the state. And the 4 big battery projects, or the 3 in Kentucky and the 1 in Tennessee, because I'm about equal distance from Eddyville to both of the Ford projects in Tennessee and Kentucky. So we're kind of right in the middle. So I included that on this slide. But all of these projects are within a Riverport hinterland, like Jennifer mentioned. And all of these projects, even if they don't need, for example, like we talked about earlier, steel in their production, a lot of them have big pieces of machinery that it's a lot more economical to bring those pieces of equipment up the river and import them into the United States and then truck them last mile to get to their facility, instead of having to ship them into New Orleans or Savannah and then truck an oversized, very heavy piece of equipment all the way to Glendale or Bowling Green and Hopkinsville. We recently, last summer, we were able to support an aluminum expansion by them bringing in some of their press and their manufacturing equipment into our port, and then they were able to truck it directly from our port 50 miles down the road. So that's really how we as ports can continue to leverage the tie-in with economic development. And I think that, just to kind of sum up all my comments, we're just in such a really great position in Kentucky. We've seen so many great economic development announcements. Our river ports are very successful, but there's a lot of path for us to grow. I think I could probably spend $15 million alone in my Eddyville port between clearing more land, building a seawall, investing in a road, extending my sewer line, extending my water lines. I think all of us probably have several projects that we could come up with. But even just going from $500,000 a year to even, close to what we're talking about with some of the moving the taxes, or even just allowing for that money to roll over year would be a huge benefit to help all of the ports. That's as quick as I can go. I'm trying to be sensitive of time. That's a lot of information to throw at all of you.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and answer questions for you. I think it'll be cleaner, and then we'll go to Greg. Representative Freeland, I believe you had a question.
I just wanted to brag on Amanda and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
She does a wonderful job. She and the board and Eddyville, and I know they do it because they enjoy doing it. It's not any other reason. But what are some things? I know I've spoken to Glenn Kinder and yourself several times about things that we could bring into Eddyville. I know it's limited in space. You mentioned the trees and the rocks, and what are some things we could do to utilize the space there?
So one of the biggest things that we're really looking at utilizing is we're in the process of attempting to acquire property from the Corps of Engineers so that we can get a little bit more waterfront. But the inlet is a great way for us to better utilize the space, because it allows us to use land that we already own and essentially create more water frontage without having to go through the Corps of Engineer. So doing projects like this, we have another small boat lift, but if we were able to expand kind of the existing water frontage and add a couple more inlets, would really help us basically expand our water frontage without having to go through the core, or our property is kind of at the end of the bay. One of the things about Eddyville that's a little different is that we are on a lake, not on a river, so we don't have to deal with fluctuating water levels or any currents. So that kind of protects us from bad weather or droughts or too much rain. So we're really able to operate a lot differently than some of the other ports on bigger rivers.
Thank you. I'd like to just follow up on that for a little bit. When you say you're going to cut an inlet in there, what's that look like?
It's big.
What's an inlet look like?
And it's basically a very, it's going to be just a very big trench almost that we're going to have to, I think, cut some rock out and basically just dig a very engineered hole in the ground, for lack of better terminology. But it'll be big enough to hold about 3 barges in. So it's going to be a very, very big, basically, piece that we cut out from our shore to have more water access.
Are you far enough along in this process to be able to ID some possible businesses or some usage for this inlet?
So we're not far enough in the process to probably have confirmed anything, but some of the big things that we're looking at, so we have one of our tenants is a barge construction facility, and right now where they are located, it might be beneficial if we could maybe relocate them to the inlet and free up some more of the water frontage and allow them to continue to expand their operations, because they do both construction of barges for barge companies that need to utilize those services, or they can repair barges. So either moving that, or I do foresee a potential where a prospect that we have at the industrial park that needs both rail and river access will request dedicated usage of the inlet for their business at the industrial park.
And kind of building on something you just said, and Jennifer, if you want to jump in on this, feel free to. You said that you mentioned that someone that might need the rail usage as well. You've talked around this a little bit. Can you talk about the importance of having quality river, road, and rail, not just to service what you've got, but as a potential attraction for future development, what kind of advantage that might give you over some of your peers? Absolutely.
So Eddyville, Kentucky is very small. The county itself is about 8,000, but because we are right along I-69 and I-24, we have access within a 50-mile radius of a population of about 800,000 people. So when we see industrial prospects looking at us, the workforce is not a huge challenge, more so than it is in any other place. I won't pretend like workforce isn't a challenge, but because we have the road access, we can easily import workers in that we need. Because we have both the rail and the river access, we can compete for much bigger scale projects that communities our size would never see. Again, because they are able to either bring in materials inbound on rail or river freight. Likewise, they are able to send outbound on the other mode of transportation. So it really allows us to have access to a bigger operation that needs different types of modes of transportation. If we did not have both rail service and river service, I know we would not see some of the projects that we are responding to and working with through the Cabinet of Economic Development. And that's specifically because we have access to both river and rail.
You mentioned economic development. Secretary Knoll was in our last meeting, and he was talking about ranking systems and how important having the 3 R's together is. Are there instances where you work with our state economic development? Do they reach out to you on any of these projects? Kind of walk us through how that works.
So usually when a project, so a project is a company that's wanting to come into the state. A project will say, I need this much land, I need this many workers to potentially fill my needs, and I need this type of infrastructure. And then the state project managers send those leads out to the communities that meet those needs of that company. And then the company basically at that point then the company is comparing each site to each site across the state, and then multiple states and different sites from each other. So it's once you say, here's all the potential areas you could locate, it's then a process of elimination. And one of the things that works specifically for our community really well is that it's a lower cost of living because it's a rural community, and we have all three major modes of transportation. We don't have the air as much, but we do have some small regional airports for people that need to fly and not freight air cargo. Does that I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, thank
Okay.
you. Anyone else have any? Chair Miles?
Yes. I noticed, I think there's a couple different numbers in here than what your presentation was today. Would you mind making sure our staff gets that so they can replace that?
Absolutely. Yes. There were a couple typos that we had in this presentation that I noticed, so I'll ensure that staff receive that. Yes, ma'am.
Numbers are important.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Greg, you want to start with what you want to talk about?
Yeah, and I really did. And I looked at all the slides and all the information. I said, I'll just sit here and tell you what I do and what goes on at our Riverport so that y'all have an understanding of a small Riverport, and that's what I'm really focusing on today.
Thank you. That was kind of why, for everybody's benefit, that's kind of why that I wanted you to come today, and thank you for driving so far. It's even further than I drove, and very seldom do I get to say that in a room up here. But I wanted to be able to do a compare and contrast and bring Greg in on this too, so thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. So as a port director at a small port like in Hickman, our number one thing, of course, is there it goes. Okay. So really, now I'll lose my train of thought. So as a small port director, like I said, 75% of everything I do is loading grain or dealing with agriculture products at our Riverport. We do other things, but that's why the $4.5 million, that infrastructure was put in 1977, and we maintain it, and we have been maintaining it, and that's where most of our funds go. That's why funding is so important. So growing has been difficult for Hickman Riverport because there's not so many opportunities to do things. We supply to the industry. We unload wire. We have our own crane. That was the last big project that we worked on there at the Riverport, was putting a new crane in. We hadn't had one. Like I said, it was put in 1978, and we replaced it in 2012. So it had been that long since one major piece of equipment had been replaced. So we're looking at what can we do. But at the same time, we have the tonnage. In our harbor, we do 1.3 million tons a year. Now, that is the Riverport and an aggregate company that's right next door and another grain company. So there's a lot coming in and out of our port. It's important to us because being on the Mississippi River, you have to worry about dredging. We do not have, like I said, the dams and locks to go through, but at the same time you have the disadvantage of being on the Mississippi where you have a lot of silt, sand. And so we're always focusing that, working with the Army Corps of Engineers out of Memphis, trying to make sure we keep the harbor open, and that's what we do. And with our numbers, it looks great. The Corps keeps us going, and we also have the Coast Guard there in our harbor. So they're an important part of it, and we have transportation. We have a ferry there going across the Mississippi River to the Missouri side. Our needs, for example, where I have the crane, I also have a second conveyor that I could load grain out, but I can't do it at the same time. We have been planning, and in our planning stages for years, how do we move the crane or move the conveyor so that we can do multiple things? I get calls constantly, what can we do? And we usually turn away more than we can actually do based on having the right equipment and being set up correctly. I think that was one of the things that you were just mentioning about economic development. No, they don't come to us and say, what can we help you do to serve our community and our areas better or bring more industry in, they do ask the question, what can you do? And we try to do our best. We only have industries in Hickman and Fulton County, or mainly in Hickman, that require products off the river, such as steel wire, in which they make concrete reinforcement. We supply that to the industries there. We also have a plant that does the electrodes, so we bring in petroleum coke. So those things, that's what we're dealing with, is what industry is actually there. We're not a very good thing for somebody looking to land for economic development because we don't have the resources, and that's what we're trying to work on. We do have rail, we do have road. I-69, I think, is going to be an important part because we're close to I-69. We're going to be from the Union City connection that they're working on now, and that's in Tennessee. We'll be about 12 miles, and then in Fulton, we're about 22 miles from the I-69 connection. We have great rail there in Fulton with the CN Railroad there in Fulton and the railroad yard. We do get some things, but that's something we're going to be focusing on with economic development, is trying to use that as a connection to the Riverport. We have short line rail into the Riverport. It's okay to use, but it's not great. That is one of the biggest needs we have there also, is to improve the rail, and that's something that we've been looking at in the past. Right now, like I said, the conveyor will be the number one thing that we're going to be looking at trying to upgrade. If it wasn't for that, then it would be warehousing. We're constantly getting calls on warehousing. What can we do in our area? Probably not going to have a lot of industry coming because we don't have the manpower in our area, but warehousing is something that is constantly being looked for. So that would be another thing we'd probably look at. Consistency with the other Riverports is probably the same, as far as we handle basically the same products. We don't do the aluminum, but everything else we do handle on a small scale. Now, what does that mean? My role, we have about 12 people that work at Riverport. I may be in a barge on a certain day helping drive a forklift or a skid loader or something like that. That's what you do at a small port. The director doesn't always just sit in an office or come to meetings. You also are down there on the water and the loading grain or doing whatever needs to be done.
So you're saying Amanda wears many hats and you wear a hard hat? Does that mean
that's kind of the truth? Yes. And we have applied for the PIDP grant, just like Eddyville and Paducah did a couple of years ago. And hopefully we will get that. That will help us with the conveyor. Then we can start focusing on the warehouse aspect of it for what we think to help the port grow.
Anyone have any questions on that? Representative Smith.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know the time's running late, but we'll probably not cross paths again. So I want to pick your brain just a little bit. You mentioned the grant that you're fixing to apply for. That was I believe it was the $100 million bond that we put together that the economic development projects could go after. What we ran against on that, and it was a challenge, was all the criteria. If there was a more fluent fund for economic development, that is skin in the game still a possibility if it was dropped from 50-50 to, say, 80-20? Does that open up an opportunity for warehousing? Can you come up with some, because it's hard to get 100% out of the body, and everybody's got a reason for it, and it's probably not the best of government to not have local skin in the game, but it also hinders when you go 50-50, and then you have to go by population, you have to reduce everything. I mean, you jump through a lot of hoops, and then you wonder if you're even going to get it. I think our best investments, and again, as the chairman pointed out, I think it's investing in knowing that it's going to create, not that we're just going to band-aid something because after 30 years you need your crane fixed. I think we need to look at I would much rather invest $20 million than $2 million if it's going to bring 30 years worth of growth to you. That's me personally. Mm-hmm. And I think that we can sell that to our other members, that if we come with a plan and we go after federal dollar pots, we go after state participation, and try to keep as less burden on these small communities, and that's what I deal with. There's a lot of my communities in the Eastern Kentucky can't even apply for the grant because they can't even come close to matching 50-50. If it was $100,000, they can't come up with 50. So, we kind of hamstring ourselves sometimes with language. But I wanted to ask that because you brought up the point, I wrote it down, the grant. And when you mentioned warehousing, because that you're saying that's your future. And that's what you've identified as your future, as growth, and it would help your port. Because then they're going to utilize your port to bring goods into warehouse. And then your warehouse is going to create jobs because you're going to have people to work at the warehouse. We're on the same page. That's the things I like to see in here. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to know about the money.
Right.
If it's more accessible, you don't have a problem with putting skin in the game, but you got to make it a possibility. It's not possible when you have to come up on a $10 million project, come up with $5 million.
Right.
But you could come up with $1 million if you could get the $10 million, or the $20 million come up with $2 or $3 million. So I just wanted to clarify that, Mr. Chairman, make sure I feel for you because I'm in the same situation in Eastern Kentucky on the dollars and on the. You was talking about hills, mountains. You haven't seen hills and mountains. We can come and move that in a week's time. So that's. But anyway, I appreciate your testimony.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and for sure on the because like with the PIDP grant, we're looking at an 80-20 match there also. So the 20% out of that $4.6 million we're talking about, that's about $900,000 for the Riverport. So we've been focusing on how to fund that through our own funds, money that we put back just for that project, as well as some local county funds, which we don't normally get.
I would like to follow up on that. Were you through? Didn't mean to cut you off there. Along the line with Representative Smith's questioning, one of the reasons that I wanted you to talk is because I think this is a good example of some of the problems that we've had with the way we fund Riverports in the past. And it helps us as policymakers, I think, to know what this looks like in real terms. Let's talk about this conveyor. This conveyor is used that you need is used for grain offloading. That's a big part of what you do, right?
That's correct.
And who's that primarily used for? What business? And talk about their relationship of Cargill with the port.
Okay. Well, of course, just like you said there, it's Cargill. They have been there now for about 25 years, or getting closer to 30 years. And their biggest thing is we're behind because we're running a smaller belt. It's 1,200 feet long, so it spans a long distance across the 94 highway all the way to the river, and so it's just an extremely important piece of equipment. Yeah, I was going to say a lot of them are right on the edge of the water, and we're 1,200 feet away, and so for them, they've got to have security in the fact that we're going to upgrade and put a new belt in. If not, they're going to have to look for a new place to continue their operation. I mean, they're not threatening or anything like that. What they're saying is we need to be able to do more. We've increased over, back in I'd say probably the early 2000s, we were probably running at 8 million bushels through the entire season. We just finished up with a small, last year about 12 million. We have done as many as 18 million bushels going through that conveyor, working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week during a period of November and December.
Yeah, I think this is an easy example for us to see the demand for a Riverport service has increased exponentially, but we haven't been able to increase our ability to service that in this situation. Talk a little bit about the difficulties of expanding this conveyor out from a point of personal reference. This has been a slow process for years. I've spent more hours of my life than I care to admit in corn and bean lines at Cargill waiting on things to get loaded and unloaded. It's been a situation that's been around for a long time. When this was built, it would barely service the demand of Cargill. But it's been a need for a long time. But talk about how the way we structure port funding and not being able to roll over, how that's limited your ability to be able to expand to meet the need of your client.
Right. Of course, it's the small amounts. as the 500. Now, all the ports use that wherever we need to, but you look at the time frame that we've got from the time we know that we have received the grant till we have to spend the money. You cannot do a big project. There's no way that you could put any funds toward the conveyor project, because that's going to be from start to finish probably a couple of year project, maybe if we're lucky, probably more like 3-year project, getting the new conveyor completely put in. So that would be a focus that we need to do something to make sure that we can get the funds, know we're going to have them, and then do a project that might take a longer period of time to do. So absolutely, that's going to be an issue that could resolve there. The time frame as far as like our contracts, I was telling Senator Howell